Now, I'm delighted to present our excellent guest speaker, Professor John Marston from El Colegio de Mexico. I first met John in 2009 in Phnom Penh when I was conducting my MA research in Cambodia. I remember well, our first long conversation was entirely in Khmer. That's how I was intrigued by his fluency in Khmer. John received his BA in English and Spanish from the University of Michigan, then MA in English as a second language from the University of Minnesota. He continued to pursue his MA and PhD in anthropology at the University of Washington at Seattle, under the supervision of Professor Charles F. Kais, who is a prominent anthropologist of Thailand and, of course, of Theravada Buddhism. As we often say in Buddhist studies about the lineage, in the importance of lineage, I honor John Marston as my intellectual uncle, because since my MA advisor Ratana Tosakun is another supervisor of Charles Kais. Professor John Marston has a fascinating career path, ranging from the refugee camps. That's how we share a common best friend, Bob March, who is an amazing human being in Cambodia. John also worked with the United Nations Transitional Authority of Cambodia and various educational and research institutions. He won many prestigious research grants and producing not only scholarly works, but also having beautiful English translations of Khmer poetry. His long list of publications doesn't only appear in English, but also in Spanish. The book, History, Buddhism, and New Religious Movements in Cambodia in 2004 becomes a canon in Khmer studies and the study of Theravada Buddhism. His most recently published work includes a research article called Dharmawara Mahathera, Sihanouk, and the cultural interface of Cambodia's Cold War relations with India, published in the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, and a book chapter in an edited volume called Simas, Foundations of Buddhist Religion. Without further delay, I would like to invite Professor John Marston to present more thoughts on a transnational Cambodian monk, Dharmawara Mahathera. Please welcome John Marston.
Well, thank you so much, Eek, and thank you to University of Wisconsin for this invitation. I've been connected with University of Wisconsin here in Madison over the years in different ways. I was a coordinator for Khmer instruction at SIASI many, many years ago, and it's always been a pleasure to come back to Madison. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to come back today. So today I'm going to talk about a Cambodian monk, although this is a monk who primarily lived in India and the United States. And I realized that, well, normally I don't give papers about things that I've already published. But I realized that probably the people who invited me were interested in this recent work I did on this monk, Dharmawara Mahathera. And so thinking about what I could do, I decided I would try to talk about him, but talk about different things. At least some of you have read my published article on this topic, but I decided I would try to skirt that and talk about some stories about him from before the period covered in the article and some things later. And so this may be an anecdotal talk, and I'll be emphasizing things that have to do with this connection with Thailand and Burma. Again, thinking that many people here at University of Wisconsin know a lot about that. And so some of these things are things that I wouldn't necessarily be able to publish because of what I don't have such solid background, but I'm hoping will raise some interesting issues. This is part of a larger project of looking at cohorts of Cambodian monks who were in India prior to 1975. And there were 32 of them Some of these monks I only know by name, almost nothing else. And some of them I found that there's quite a bit of information. My original project was to look at them as a group and not necessarily to focus on individuals, but two of them are quite famous. This monk, Dharmawara Mahathera, and another monk, Mahagosananda. And so inevitably my research has focused on these two more famous monks who will probably figure prominently if I ever manage to finish this book. However, in some sense, what I'm interested in is not these monks as heroic figures, but how they figure as in relationship to other monks and to their time. So in a way, what I'm looking at is a way of using them as a lens of looking at what was going on in Cambodian Buddhism, looking at what was going on in Buddhism in India, and later on, since several of them end up coming to the United States, looking at them in relationship to Cambodian Buddhism in the United States. So this monk, once I wrote something, Dharmawara Mahathera would have come to have many Western followers in the United States and Europe, some of who are still around today. And one thing I wrote, I sent to one of his followers, and I'd used the word colorful. And the follower replied and said, colorful is the right word to use. And colorful, and one of the reason he said that is this is a monk who became associated with meditation on colors, and also color healing. And so that's why we associate him with color. So the word colorful can be a little bit condescending, perhaps, and yet think of him as a colorful figure. But what made him colorful in part was the way he traveled from country to country, from person to person. And so think of him as a transnational figure, and to what extent his color suggests something about his time and the different movements he realized. So Dharmawara he was born in 1989. I don't know if that's here. He came from an elite family. He was French educated. He was one of the first Cambodians to attend the Cambodian School of Civil Administration. He became one of the first Cambodians to be a French colonial bureaucrat. At first he had a judicial position. Later on he had more of at the end of his career he was a district chief, which was quite an important position, very unusual for Cambodians at that point. He had trouble with the Cambodian administration fairly early. He was, so the first trouble he had was in 1921. When he was arrested, there was a raid on a house where there was gambling and drinking. Here's what, in the quote above, says, his file in French says, the existence of such morals and elements which should be the elite of the indigenous population is painful to note. Nights of drinking and gambling, mine officials as well as indigenous notables responsible for the collection of taxes are of such a nature as to disturb the already weak spirits of the population. I believe it is appropriate to put a brake on dangerous tendencies that have extended to such a degree. Defenders are formally ordered not to repeat this. Oh, and here's a picture of him that I found in the files in the National Archives in Cambodia, which gives an idea of what he looked like in this time. It's the earliest photo I found of him, although I've talked to people who've also seen pictures from his youth. Just to put this a little bit in context, here's a quotation by our beloved Aunt Hansen, who was writing in the same, about what Ok Nha In wrote the same year, in 1921, the same year as when he was arrested for gambling. In one narrative, the story of the minister who is addicted to opium. An addicted official uses his power and rank to inflict harm on others. extorting revenue from villagers to finance his growing opium use. In other instances, opium and alcohol use, to which in makes repeated reference in one text, are used both literally and metaphorically to depict the character of modern society. Well, there's nothing to indicate that Dharmawara took opium, although he seemed to have been a drinker and a gambler. He was one of the first Cambodians to own a car. He clearly lived a high life in this point. In 1926, he was arrested for a misappropriation of funds, and ultimately all we know is what is in the National Archives. His family has different stories. There are ways of interpreting it this way, but we know that he was arrested and he was jailed, and he ran away in early 1927. And he ran away and he became a monk. So he was in Laos, and from Laos he went to Thailand, to Siam in those days, and from there to Burma, eventually to India. Now we have very little documentation of this period. What we have is a third-person short biography of him that was apparently written shortly before his death. We don't know exactly who helped him write this, to what extent he had input in it, and since he would have been over 100 years old at that time, to what extent his memory, if he was being consulted, would be accurate. And so this text is problematic in some ways, but it's one of the few things we have. And so let me quickly read this. He first went to Laos and then crossed over to Ubon Ratchathani, Thailand, during the reigns of King Rama VI and VII, where he was ordained a second time. It was here that he was introduced to a high-ranking Buddhist monk, a living saint known as Chokun Upali Gunapamacharya, and I apologize for my Thai pronunciation, who had the mastery of Buddhism both in Gambadura, and Patipatidura, or Pariyatidura, and Vipassanadura. He was believed to be a living arahat, who was highly respected by one and all, from the man in the street to the princes and kings. Under his guidance, he not only learned to practice meditation and concentration of mind, and to live a life of solitude in the forest, but also the hard life of rigid disciplines of asceticism, deprived of all ease and comfort. He studied with this teacher in the forest bordering the frontiers of Thailand and Cambodia, in the territories of Chiang Wat Surin and Kukan for about 6 years. As a result of Buddhist studies, he earned 3 degrees, one of which is equivalent to a doctorate of divinity and Christianity. He then went to Bangkok in Burma, where he was given ordination for the 3rd time, and learned to practice meditation under the direct guidance of a living saint named Most Venerable Sobana Mahathera Mahashi Sayadaw Rangoon. He also learned another method as taught by the Most Venerable Ledi Sayadaw, who is also respected as a saint. Now, this again, I have not used this in my publications, in part because it's problematic in some ways, that the number of years doesn't really add up. Could he have spent 6 years in Thailand, and because we know he spent time in Burma, he learned Burmese, although we don't know how well. So there's things here that Mahashi Sayadaw in these years was not yet in public prominence. So there's things here that don't make sense. And yet there seemed to be some basis of fact here as well. And so this is an intriguing document in terms of what it suggests, what it doesn't. When I first tried to find about Upali, and by the way, these are partly questions for those of you who are Thai experts or Burmese experts in the question. I want to hear your ideas, and you can completely disagree with what I'm saying, but when I first tried to find about Upali, the first sources I found seemed to think Upali would have been Bangkok at this time. Then later on I found this text from J.L. Taylor that seems like he did go from Bangkok to northern Thailand. Upali was quite an important figure, although the figure most of us who study Theravada Buddhism know about from this time is Ajahn Mun. And so for me, you know, I've read about Achan Mun as who is a Pali in relationship to all this. And so, well, here's some points. I won't go over them all. Senior patron and father figure of the Northeastern Forest tradition, friend of Achan Mun since childhood, studied in Bangkok but returned to the Northeast to meditate, etc., etc., etc. So the point I was to make is we don't really know what's accurate, what's not. One thing that is strange about the passage that I read before is that on the one hand, it claims that Dharmawara was in the forest tradition. On the other hand, it claims that he had higher learning as a monk. And these two things did not seem so consistent to me. But one figure who did combine these things is Upali. And so this is suggestive. We don't know if it's true. He may have claimed these things without them being true. But it's suggestive of what he may have done in Thailand in this period of times. Okay, so here's another document, which is very suggestive, without us being able to take it very far. The document I have was shown to me by Dharmawara's grandson. Dharmawara had a child before he became a monk, and so he does have grandchildren, and his grandson has been quite generous with me of showing some of these documents. Now, I don't know how well the figure of Lokanatha is well known among, but there's been he's a fascinating figure. Again, like many people connected with Dharmawara, he's a colorful figure. Who dates this figure and was very much talked about in the 1930s and in the Theravada world. He is an Italian-American Buddhist monk. But the document states that the International Buddhist Mission and Religious Tract Society in Thaton, Burma, that states that he was admitted on April 1934 to this association at the Lokanatha Siamese Buddhist Expo Camp. And so, what does this mean? So let me tell you about Lokanatha, who's another fascinating, colorful figure. Lokanatha was born Salvatore Chioffi in 1897 in Italy, but moved with his family to Brooklyn when he was 4. He finished a degree in chemistry, but after being given a book of Buddhist texts, developed a passionate interest in the religion. He traveled to India via England and took monastic vows in Sri Lanka in 1925. After going to Burma, then he went back to the country of his birth, Italy, and then he returned to India on foot, finally arriving in 1928. He spent several years in India as a forest monk. And then this is the thing that links him to Southeast Asia and the Theravada world more generally. He began to lead expeditions of monks traveling by foot to India. A group left from Burma in 1933, from Thailand in 1934, and from Sri Lanka in 1935. And by all accounts, these were sort of disastrous trips, that the majority of the monks who left with him never made it to India. Many of them dropped by the wayside. And so, what do we know? We don't have the documentation to say that Dharmawara actually went to India at this time. It could be that he was already in Burma and he joined the Thai Lokanatha group and then went on with them to India. Or another possibility is that he came in 1934 from Thailand as part of this group, but then stayed in Burma. So again, this is this intriguing document which doesn't give us what we want to know, but it shows that these movements were happening at the time. And Dharmawara, what we know is that in this figure, monks in Thailand and Burma and Sri Lanka were fascinated with the idea of going to India and and rescuing India for Buddhism, recovering Buddhism in India. And whether Dharmawara went in this year with the Lokanatha group, or whether he went later, we don't know. But we know that in some ways, this idea of going to India captured his imagination, and eventually he would end up in India. Then he became a healer, and this is something important for him. Something throughout he would eventually become famous for as a healer. And so here's another one of these documents that is in circulation with his followers. Again, we don't know the exact circumstances of the composition, but just to remind you, at a certain point, apparently early in his time in India, he discovered that he had a gift for healing. And I guess I'll read this in full again. At first, I learned about healing in order to help myself. You know, there's these stories of how he arrived in India in terrible physical condition. He was, you know, that he almost died from his sicknesses, and so at first I learned about healing in order to help myself. After I was cured, I learned how to heal others. Anyone can be a healer, but of course, there are some who are gifted with a special healing power, the laying on of hands. I myself have this gift, but it took me many years to discover it. When I was in India, a man with a very sad face came and asked me to go and see his ailing wife. I had read in a book that some people had this healing power in the hands. So I thought I might as well try, and there was nothing else I could do. She had a cancer of the abdomen, and I asked her husband if I could touch her. He said, yes, by all means. I was thinking that even if she died under my hands, they couldn't blame me. Mere touch can't kill anyone. So I laid my hands on her and prayed in my mind to the Buddha to help me. The moment I put my hands on her, it had a soothing effect. She went to sleep at once. After 3 hours, the husband came. He told me that when she woke up, it was just as if she'd never been sick. She said that she did not know anything after I put my hands on her. It was like she had taken a sleeping pill. The pain also had gone, and when she woke up, she did not feel that she had anything wrong with her. You can imagine my happiness to know that I could heal like that. It was a great thing to me. So it was from that day that I came to know that I had this power. This was the beginning, how I came to heal. That is the reason I touch people. Well, here's where I'm going to skip over some things. It was on the basis of this healing that he connected with key figures in India. The story, again, we don't know for accurate, is that he healed Nehru's uncle. In any case, he had connections, not necessarily with Nehru as some claim, but definitely with Nehru's family. They helped him. He was originally in what's now Pakistan. Eventually, his friends helped him acquire a temple on the outskirts of New Delhi, which we'll talk about later. This was in 1948. So it was about this time, and this was, of course, when India was becoming independent, that, among other things, there was a great interest in relics at that time, Buddhist relics. Two in particular, they were relics of disciples of the Buddha. Later we can call them the Sanchi relics. They were returned by British authorities to India and Sri Lanka, and then about this time they began going on tours with the sponsorship of the Mahabodhi Society. They went to different sites in India. They went to other places, sort of connected to India, like Sikkim, which was at that point not yet part of India proper. And eventually in 1952, they toured to Cambodia. And Dharmawara at this time returned to Cambodia for the first time after 25 years. They said he was from an elite family. He quickly connected with Sihanouk, who was the king at that time, later abdicated, became the head of state. This was a time of key changes in Cambodia, and this is basically the topic of the article, my published article, which I don't want to repeat in detail here. but he had an interesting connection to Sihanouk at the time of his. And in my article, I talk about how all this related to the underlying culture of the Cold War. And among other things, he played a role, apparently, in Sihanouk's connection to India, and through India to the non-aligned movement. But I'm not going to take time to go into that now. But as a prominent monk connected to Sihanouk, he began to have more of a world profile. By 1954, Dharmawara was assuming more and more the role of representative of Cambodian Buddhism. He published a short, cogent article about Cambodian Buddhism for the magazine Buddhist World. In it, he praised Sihanouk and Junat and makes reference to the historical role of Suzanne Capellas. In January, a Burmese publication devoted to the Sixth Buddhist Council activities mentioned that he had been in Burma recently, since it refers to him returning home to Cambodia. He seems to have stopped in Burma on his way back to Cambodia. He was then back in Rangoon in May as part of the Cambodian delegation to the opening ceremonies of the Sixth Buddhist Council, landmark event in Theravada Buddhism. And those of you who are interested in Theravada Buddhism will know that this period, well, especially the 1956 to 1957 ceremony celebrating the halfway point of the Buddhist era was, this was a big thing throughout the Buddhist world. And in Burma it was a 2-year process, and beginning in 1954. The Cambodian patriarch Junat made his opening remarks in French before yielding the floor to Dharmawara to say something in English. Dharmawara's knowledge of English and Burmese may have made his inclusion in the delegation seem natural. He accompanied Sihanouk on a trip to Burma again in November 1954. Then, again, as part of this, his political gadabouts, he, in Cambodia, the U.S. Embassy began to be interested in him. He went to the United States in 1955 as well. And while in the United States, after going to Washington, D.C., he spent some time in California. There he met a figure named Robert Balser, another very colorful figure. We'll just mention briefly, Balser was a journalist, and he was a wine merchant, which is not very Buddhist. His family were wine merchants. He began writing about wine. He supposedly is the person who put California wine on the map. And he had lots of Hollywood friends. Supposedly he was the lover of Gloria Swanson. If those of you who know old movie history, Balser's home on Mulholland Drive was eventually sold to Marlon Brando, if you're into obscure movie facts. But anyway, Balser was already interested in Buddhism. He'd already traveled in Asia. He was planning another trip, and Dharmawara said, well, come to Cambodia instead, and you can be there at the coronation of Saramarit, who is Sihanouk's father, who, after Sihanouk abdicated, became king. So on the way there, again, I'm trying to bring out little things having to do with Thailand. And so on the way back, they went by way of Thailand. And Balser tells a story of meeting the Thai patriarch. So again, this is a minor story, but I hope captures some of the spirit of things. This is what Balser writes. He talks about relaxing in the cloistered halls of Bangkok's favorite pagoda, Wat Bintamapopit, the marble wat built by King Chalong, and I was taken into the genial world of men in the robes. Here was nothing in black, the Larissima of Christian retreats. Cigarettes passed back and forth with stories and anecdotes from other pagodas of the venerable Dharmawara's trip to America. Come now and we will visit the Supreme Patriarch, Mahathera told me. He's very old and is just recovering from surgery in the hospital. No Christian was ever presented to the Pope of Rome with more respect than I was carried into the hospital room of His High Holiness the Supreme Patriarch of the Kingdom of Thailand, Samdak Pranarach Mahathera, dropped to his knees, touched his forehead to his palms on the floor 3 times, rose, turned, and presented me, speaking in Thai. Mahathera explained my presence quickly. So again, this is it's a minor story. What does it really tell us? It tells us, I think, that he had a relaxed role with a Thai monkhood. He could joke with monks, Thai monks, at one of the most important Thai wats. He had access to the Thai patriarch. You know, many monks had access to the Thai patriarch, but it gives us a little bit of a glimpse of him at this time. So, so I want to talk a little bit about Dharmawara's temple in India. In about 1960, he was, because of tensions with the Cambodian monastic authorities, he was asked to stop coming to Cambodia, and he did, except that in 1962 he did make one short visit to Cambodia, and he brought back his 2 oldest grandchildren to India, and they stayed with him at his temple in India, where they were to receive their education. This is the temple called the Ashoka Mission, which is what we closely associate closely with Dharmawara. I like this picture because this picture was from the 70s, but you get a sense of, it has the name Ashoka there. You see the flowers. Here's another letterhead. I think this was probably from the late 60s. It was described as a health center as well. Here are my pictures, which were taken recently. This is a walled compound. It's really almost part of an archaeological site, Qutub Minar, one of the most important archaeological sites in the area of New Delhi. This was a walled Mughal compound. Exactly what it was historically, we don't know, but somehow he was given control of this compound. It's a garden area. At the time, this would have been some distance from the city itself. Now the city's expanded, and outside of this, it's a very urbanized area. It's significant for our purposes that there was a youth hostel there associated with the Quakers, and this is sort of plays a role in our family. And the youth hostel in some ways represented a separate world from the temple proper. It has been described as the cheapest place to stay in the area of Delhi and attracted backpackers on shoestring budgets, some coming in groups and vans, some did not pay at all. As one might expect in the 60s, there was drug usage mentioned in more than one source. I quote Roth, "The place was unsupervised, save for a zany sweeper named Bagal, who hustled bakshish by pantomime. At night, the doorless niches became candlelit conversation pits. Chillums of hashish were passed around and everyone partook. Swapping adventures and survival tips provided the entertainment and a way of attaining status." This is, the youth hostel, though it figures in our story, in some ways was separate from the temple itself. The main temple was a former Mughal audience hall with a flat roof. There was a small ordination hall built by Unu in 1954, and a handful of houses for monks and visitors to the temple, some built by the Cambodian monks Khel Pama and Porwan in 1960-61. And here are his Dharmawara with his grandchildren, who basically grew up in the temple, and they have had their own colorful lives. Paval, the girl, happened to be a video of her talking about something completely different, which I won't go into. But in that, she talks a little bit about the Ashoka mission. She said she had a nanny and an English tutor. There was a great abundance of flowers tended by several gardeners and fruit trees and a small animal sanctuary. Sam St. Clair Ford, who ordained as a monk there for a while in the 70s, also emphasized the animals there. Among the domestic animals were a pet rabbit, 3 guinea fowls and ducks. There were wild peacocks, parakeets, hoopoes, and black-beaked drongos. Cambodian and Lao monks were regular, if not constant, present at the Ashoka mission. Although the Cambodian monks who came to India to study were often concentrated at other locations, Navanalanda Mahavihara, Banaras Hindu University, and later University of Pune, there were typically, since the 1950s, at least a few based in the Delhi area, who would on occasion stay periods of time at the mission or come to visit it on the weekends. The mission was an important point of cultural reference for the embassies of Southeast Asian Theravada countries. It served as a Buddhist temple, but also a focus of community and a destination for day trips out of the central city. Samantha Power, who came to India with her sister, the wife of a Cambodian diplomat, and attended a private girls' school in 1958-62, recalls Sunday excursions to the mission. Kuntal Cheng, Dharmawara's grandson, said that the Burmese embassy staff would come out once a month. His memory of the Burmese ambassador making a donation of 25 chickens to the mission tells us something of the familiarity of the relationship. This was Ken Key, the widow of Burmese national hero Aung San, who was ambassador to India from 1960 to 67. Her daughter, Aung San Suu Kyi, studied in India at this time as well at Convent of Jesus and Mary School, and later completed her secondary schooling at Lady Shri Ram College before going to Oxford in 1964. And so here's the pictures of Madam Ken Key with, and this is Aung San Suu Kyi as a baby, and this is probably her in the period, Aung San Suu Kyi with her mother in this, about this period. One of the most intriguing documents kept by Dharmawara's family is a letter to Dharmawara from Aung San Suu Kyi in London, dated December 14th, 1967, when she was 22 and had completed her BA, long before anyone would have suspected her later prominence. She starts the letter talking about having finished school and about different work she's doing. How are the children getting on at school? And how is the garden getting on? Do you hear from my mother? I think she's missing her friends in Delhi. India had become a second home to her. Most of the letter is typewritten, but at the end is a handwritten note. May I ask for your blessing to help and guide me in the coming year of decision? With deepest reverence, Sun. So, again, I don't want to exaggerate the importance of this. It's, you know, he happened to have a connection with Aung San Suu Kyi. And, you know, this wasn't that important. It doesn't tell us that much about him or about her, and yet it helps, again, give us a picture of who he was. And he was also, the Ashoka mission was very much a Buddhist site. Meditation was essential to Dharmawara's practice. Dharmawara was deeply connected to Buddhist institutions throughout India and international. At the same time, we must keep in mind that Dharmawara's role as a healer and advocate of health and healing practices connected to him to other worlds in India. The Indians who came to him for healing were not generally Buddhist. Most were poor Indians who lived in the vicinity of the mission. A few came from farther away. Dharmawara's healing is often characterized in simpler terms as color therapy, the most unusual and characteristic technique he used. However, it is evident that other methods were also part of his repertoire for health and healing. We know that yoga exercise was of interest to him at least since the 1940s. Yoga was part of the routine of the mission for Dharmawara and resident monks following morning meditation. Those who came for healing might receive advice on diet. Roth was an American who was at the Ashoka Mission in 1970-71. And he provides the best account of Dharmawara's healing practices at the Ashoka Mission in the late 60s, which is also the best account of what his color therapy meant in social terms. And I quote, "Mick and I watched him at his mission putting colored bottles out to stand in the sunlight for days, then begging them off to his secret larder. He dispensed the most simple and competent medical treatment around. I saw people with hepatitis, a rather common but dangerous illness to get in India, recovering after a few days of rest with nothing but teaspoons of water from these bottles, eating what he prepared for them and basking under his colored lamps. He even cured one traveler diagnosed with rabies, saying afterwards that it was good that the patient came to him before the illness was far advanced. Hard to cure," he said. Some followers of Dharmawara maintain that his use of chromotherapy derived from what they call a little-known Buddhist text. This could be a reference to techniques of meditation on colored disc elaborated in the Visuddhimagga, which is, of course, in fact, a very well-known 5th century AD Pali text. Although, to my knowledge, there is okay. There's no tradition of these techniques extending to use in healing. Sam St. Clair Ford, who was a British man who ordained there as a monk, writes that Dharmawara recalled the use of color, kashinas in Thai forest meditation, where they would use candles and lanterns with colored cloth as a focus. But according to another follower, British follower, Chrissy Mann, Dharmawara was aware of Western chromotherapy, written about the American naturopath Edwin Babbitt. It may be that Dharmawara drew on more than one source as he developed techniques that worked for him. There are deeply ingrained traditions in Southeast Asia and elsewhere of Buddhist monks and ex-monks involved in traditional healing, even where such practices are frowned on by monastic authorities. However, according to one elderly Cambodian monk who had known Dharmawara at the Stockton Temple, his practices had nothing to do with traditional Cambodian practices. His practices were, in the elderly monk's words, Western. While this may point to the elderly monk's ignorance of non-reform meditation practices, I think this does point to the fact that Dharmawara was working with something new outside of traditional practices. The same monk told me that Dharmawara's healing practices worked for Dharmawara himself because of his spiritual gifts as they related to healing. But they were not, he said, techniques that would work for anyone else. This is consistent with my own perceptions of what was happening, although at least a few of Dharmawara's followers have attempted to apply chromotherapy more generally. And here's a prayer to green light, which is now inscribed in a memorial to Dharmawara, and just to show the extent to which he came to be associated with green light meditation in particular. Okay, well, in the time remaining, eventually he would connect with a major follower of Gurdjieff. This takes us off in different directions, and in directions that don't have much to do with Southeast Asia or Theravada Buddhism. I don't know to what extent I want to talk about Gurdjieff here. Gurdjieff was a major religious figure of the 20th century. He was born in the Caucasus. Early in his life, he traveled We don't know to what extent what he wrote about his travels was true, or to what extent it was legend. He went to the Middle East, he went to perhaps to Tibet, and yet what he came up with by World War I was a very incredibly complex synthesis of different religious traditions, including Christian mysticism and perhaps Tibetan factors, other factors. Between the he and his followers fled Russia. They were in Moscow at the time of World War I. Then they ended up fleeing as the revolution happened. They were prominent in the vicinity of Paris in the period between World War I and World War II. There were many prominent literary figures from England and the United States who associated with Gurdjieff. And then after World War II, he had another resurgence of interest in him before he died. So what we're interested in is one of his followers was named J.G. Bennett. And J.G. Bennett knew Gurdjieff quite early. He was British and he had his own schools, and in the post-World War II period, he came to his own prominence as someone who promoted Gurdjieff's teaching. And eventually it would be J.G. Bennett who would develop a connection to Dharmawara. And J.G. Bennett also had his own strange, colorful history. He, at one point, he was connected with the Sufi intellectual Idris Shah for Southeast Asian studies. There was a period when he became an enthusiastic of a Javanese mystic called Pak Subu, who had a Javanese mystical movement called Subud. And then, so Bennett had this capacity for enthusiasm for different religious figures. I don't believe that we can say that Dharmawara's philosophy really had that much to do with Gurdjieff in philosophy, although some might disagree with that. What is the case, I think, is that Bennett was attracted to remarkable men, in the Gurdjieffian phrase. He was, and somehow when he met Dharmawara, he had a sense of connection with a spiritual presence. So when I practice this with my students, this talk, and just whenever we use the word hippie, then it seems to inspire laughter. And so, you know, these are the kind of things that we don't usually intellectualize yet. And yet we know that eventually, just as we intellectualize the Cold War, we're going to intellectualize the hippies and their movements. So in the 60s, there developed a hippie trail when young people developed an interest in Eastern religions, in the Sufi mysticism of Afghanistan, as well as the Indian religions in the late 60s. And for a while, this was when you could easily pass through Afghanistan, and you could travel from Europe to India by car or by bus. Then there were buses making these trips, and it became part of the youth movement of that time. One of the drivers of these buses was someone named Brian Page, and Brian Page was connected with a group of young men who had a connection to Bennett. And Brian Page somehow going to India. Brian Page was really more interested in Sufism than he was in Buddhism. But Brian Page somehow discovered Dharmawara and his Ashoka mission. And he used to call him a Sufi Buddhist monk. And through Dharmawara, through Brian Page, then he told other friends who were in the circle of Bennett about Dharmawara. This led to Bennett, and one of the key persons was this young man named Michael Sutton, who we won't go into here. And about this time, Bennett, who'd had his up and downs with his own religious teaching in the school, decided to form a new school at what was once a private school for boys, and he called it Sherborne House, or the International Academy for Continuous Education. And during the first year, he had an opportunity to go to India, and on the recommendation of some of these young men, he visited Dharmawara and had an immediate rapport with him, which resulted in him inviting Dharmawara to teach at his school, which he did for the next few years, once a year. So, anyway, the last section, when I gave a paper at AS in the spring in Hawaii, and in a draft chapter, I talk about 3 of Dharmawara's Western followers at this time. And at that time, I talked about a young British man who became ordained as a monk under him. In order to vary it, I'm going to talk very briefly about another of these figures, who was American, whose name is Elizabeth Romig. She wrote this book. It's a self-published book called Leaving Lucifer. It's a terrible title. It sounds like Dharmawara was Lucifer, but it refers to her general sense of leaving the evil things behind and finding herself. Here's another picture of her on the right, which I also found on the internet, which gives a sense of what she probably looked at like at that time. She was 23 in 1974 and very much caught up in the counterculture movements of the time. She writes that she developed an interest in the idea of a kingdom of God, and she and her boyfriend of the time began to look for what they conceived of as a way, quote, to train for entry into the kingdom of God. The boyfriend had friends attending the 3rd course at Sherborne, and they began exploring the possibility of going there. Sherborne put them in touch with George and Mary Cornelius, their representatives in Alaska. This is George and Mary in the older couple, in the picture with Dharmawara. George, by then 60, had been stationed in London with American Naval Intelligence in World War II and met Mary, a nurse a few years older than him, when they both took shelter in a metro station during a bombing raid. Mary was already involved in Bennett's Institute and drew George into it when they became a couple. Romig and her boyfriend began going to the Anchorage group meetings and participating in Gurdjieffing exercises and work projects. The group had plans to bring Dharmawara to Alaska, and group members organized a project to chop firewood and sell it as a way to raise money for his plane ticket. This was probably Dharmawara's first trip to Alaska, one of several the Corneliuses arranged before they moved to Oregon in 1982. His visit generated enough interest that people came from other parts of Alaska, some curious about his color healing, and he led nightly meditations. Quote, "We meditated in George and Mary's basement. Green lights replaced the high wattage house lights. They shone down on us as we sat cross-legged on the floor, snugly gathered together. A group of about 30 was gathered for the first night. I meditated. Bhante sat in the middle against the black wall, sitting on cushions. Slowly he lit 3 incense sticks that were standing upright in a vase filled with sand. He waved his hand, extinguished the flame, and the sandalwood balsam wafted through the air. The room became still as the green charred smoke encircled our efforts." Well, I'm running out of time, but quickly, that Dharmawara was promoting a course to be taught in India at the Ashoka Mission. And Romig, perhaps like the other participants in this course, had little overseas experience. She went to India. It was a great experience for life. There were 15 people participating in the course. It was a very intense course in meditation, probably using techniques of Vipassana from Burma. In the book, she describes this in detail, describes the interactions among the people involved, and how by the end she felt like she had an experience. At the end of the course, Dharma invited her to stay in India, and she made the decision not to stay. She returned to Alaska, married her boyfriend, and spent a time in the wilderness of Alaska. Although later, when Dharmawara was primary in the United States, she would also become affiliated. So I'm going to end with that, and again, return to what I said before about what I'm presenting here is a lot of anecdotes, and I hope at the least they give you a sense of this colorful figure and why he was colorful. But again, to think about these different episodes, Dharmawara as a forest meditator in Thailand, perhaps connected with Lokanatha, beginning to build a world in India, participating in the 1954-56 celebrations for the Buddha Jayanti, that these were, in some sense, movements that went beyond the locality of where he was and tell us something about different transnational movements having to do with Buddhism and having to do with religion more generally at that time. And so I'm going to end with that and open up for questions.